We are recording. All right. Okay, can everyone see my slide here? Great.
Yep, looks good, Ryan.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Well, today we will cover just a little bit of an outline for you, an overview of the National Fish Habitat Partnership nationally. That'll be provided by Alex and I. Coordinating your FHP, that will be from Joe Noner. uh, Coordinator for the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership. Representing your FHP, Lori Maloney, Coordinator for the Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture. Funding, Debbie Hart, Southeast Alaska Fish Habitat Partnership. Communications, I will cover that. And congressional FHP designation will be covered by Alex. And we certainly appreciate the coordinators, offering their insights as part of this. So, overview of the National Fish Habitat Partnership. We'll start out with some staff. Obviously, had some introductions earlier. Alex Atkinson, who sits at NOAA, myself, sitting at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and somebody scoured LinkedIn for my photo, I think. So, and then Amy Horstman. She was unable to join us today, but she is currently acting as the NFHP coordinator, although she will be taking on a role as the fish passage coordinator at the service permanently. So she's acting in the NFHP role currently. And then we also have Gary Whalen, who was mentioned, Daniel Weefrey, and Kate Sherman as well. So just a look at the National Fish Habitat Partnerships map that we have. This isn't a super dynamic map, but it's the most up-to-date one that we have with the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative included. So we will be revising this map in the near future to make this, a little bit more user-friendly and be able to kind of delineate out some regions. But, we have all 50 states covered across our 20 partnerships. The partnerships are really focused either geographically, by species, or by system, and that being the reservoir partnership being focused on both in reservoir habitat as well as upstream and downstream habitat as well from reservoirs. Whoa, skip one there. The National Fish Habitat Partnership mission is to protect, restore, and enhance the nation's fish and aquatic communities through partnerships that foster habitat conservation and improve the quality of life for the American people. This is, a bit of a diagram of just sort of how the partnership is set up with the National Fish Habitat Board at the top. Obviously, fish habitat partnerships being a center point because, without really the work of the fish habitat partnerships and all the work that you do putting conservation funding on the ground and matching funds and all of those things, we really wouldn't be here in many aspects. And then you have board staff, and newly created last year were committees of the board, which we will talk about a little bit more in depth. And then obviously National Fish Habitat Partners at the bottom, and that includes the many people that in organizations that partner with the National Fish Habitat Partnerships on the ground conservation projects. So a quick recap of National Fish Habitat Partnership history. The concept for the National Fish Habitat Partnership was an idea that was formed in 2001 through the Sport Fishing and Boating Partnership Council. That is a federal advisory committee of the Department of the Interior. And Gary Myers, who was the former director of the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, state director, really spearheaded the effort. The National Fish Habitat Partnership, if you know about NACA in the North, in the way that the North American Waterfowl Management Plan is established, they have all those regional partnerships modeled very much after that. And that was sort of by design. And often in the early days, NFHP was called NACA for fish. In 2006, the first National Fish Habitat Action Plan was signed in April in 2006. We typically highlight that date every year. On our social media and through other news stories. First meeting of the board was held September 22nd, 2006 in Aspen, Colorado. There were initially 5 fish habitat partnerships that came into NFHP right at the beginning. Those were the Southeast Aquatic Resources Partnership, Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture, Western Native Trout Initiative, Driftless Area Restoration Effort, and Matsu Basin Salmon Habitat Partnership in Alaska. In 2010 to 2011, the first National Fish Habitat Assessment was completed. In 2011, the National Fish Habitat Action Plan then adopted the National Fish Habitat Partnership branding. We did have some discussion of that at our last board meeting as well. And in 2012, the second National Fish Habitat Action Plan was released, and essentially it built upon the initial action plan that was developed in 2006 that really crafted some new objectives and goals for the action plan, given that the first action plan we met a significant amount of the objectives that were set forth in that. In 2016, the second National Fish Habitat Assessment was completed. And in 2020, the America's Conservation Act was signed into law, which codified the National Fish Habitat Partnership, and that was in Title II of the America's Conservation Enhancement Act. And to date, 1,378 projects have been implemented under the 20 partnerships through the National Fish Habitat Partnership. So here is the full staff, and we have Shannon Boyle. She's a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She really has played a role along with Amy in coordinating the National Fish Habitat Partnership at the Fish and Wildlife Service during their filling of that position permanently. Already kind of covered everybody else here, and most of them were introduced. I think Daniel is not on the call today, but he serves as the co-chair for the Science and Data Committee with USGS. Here is a snapshot of our National Fish Habitat Board. And we have we have a rather large board, 26 members are to have seats per the ACE Act that passed. We have representation from states through all of the regional associations of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So we have representatives from the Southeast, West, Midwest, and Northeast. And the chairman of the board serves as the AFWA representative on the board, and that is Robert Boyles, who introduced and kicked off the call. We have 5 federal agencies represented on the board. Steve Gerton from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Ann Kinzinger from USGS, Sam Rauch, NOAA Fisheries. We also have the U.S. Forest Service represented on the board. And am I forgetting somebody? Yeah, anyhow, you could find out a little bit more about our board members on the website, and it also has the dates that their terms expire. So, and that is something else that we've been really busy with in terms of staff for the board in making sure that we have all of the seats filled.
Thanks,
Is it?
Ryan. Yeah, I'm going to jump in and cover
All right,
the
great.
next couple, and I'll hand it back to you in a little bit. So I just wanted to dive a little bit into the ACE Act. I know that it's going to be addressed in some of the FHP remarks later, but just to kind of cover the high level, I know Ryan noted that the ACE Act of 2020 codified the National Fish Habitat Partnership and prescribed a certain membership of the board, which was reformulated very soon after the passage of the act to that membership that you see now. And it also authorized, among other things, funding to partner organizations, including 5 federal agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, Forest Service, and EPA, up to $400,000 each. We've yet to see that actually come out in appropriations, but it's authorized by this act. The program, like NFHP wide, is authorized to receive up to $7.2 million, with 5% of that dedicated to administration. And then there are many other requirements that are outlined in the ACE Act that impact various elements of NFHP, whether that be the board, reporting, or FHPs. And so we will talk a little bit more about this, but I did note a couple of the reporting requirements here. We have an annual report that's due every winter by February 1st. And then there's also a 5-year report that is due to Congress. And there's also a requirement for this congressional designation, which we'll touch on a little bit later. There are a lot of other provisions, and we'll definitely be following up with everybody I know we only sent like 3 materials for the new folks in advance of this training, but we anticipate sending out a pretty good zip file of a lot of other important NFHP materials, and we will make sure to include a copy of the ACE Act so that you can take a look through that and be familiar with those requirements as well. Next slide, Ryan. So stepping kind of further down in terms of guiding documents and strategic plans for NFHP, basically the action plan is kind of NFHP's strategic plan. And so this is sort of the streamlined version, the 5-second sort of stripped down version of what is in the action plan are these sort of 5 main objectives. But we definitely encourage folks to access the full version of the action plan online. I will note that the action plan was due for an update. The board had been kind of on a 6-year schedule of updating this action plan and just revising and updating. And so we were due for an update and we're working on an update on the plan when the legislation was passed. So I do see this being likely revisited in the next coming months with the board. So this is linked on the NFHP website, but you'll see the 5 goals here: to achieve measurable habitat conservation results, establish a consensus set of national conservation strategies, broaden the community of support for fish habitat conservation, fill gaps in the National Fish Habitat Assessment, which we'll also hear a little bit more about later, and then communicate the conservation outcomes produced collectively by fish habitat partnerships. Next slide, Ryan. And then we are also sort of another sort of guiding document or guiding principle for NFHP is these national conservation priorities. So we've sort of gone from high level legislation down to this action plan, which is sort of the NFHP strategic plan. And then one further step down is these conservation priorities. And this is part of one of the requirements of the ACE Act, was that the board would adopt these conservation a suite of conservation priorities. And so the list here on the slide is basically the abbreviated list of what those approved national conservation priorities were that were voted and adopted by the board in September of last year. So we will also be distributing, or I think it was distributed in your materials that you got for this call that's attached to the calendar invite. There is a document that has each of these conservation priorities with a little bit of a short description underneath which each priority. And these are important for FHPs to note, since all of your projects have to address one of these NCPs. And that is not, not necessarily a huge challenge, since you're, working on a lot of these topics, but it really ties back to the mission of NFHP. And so these are kind of the big drivers, the conservation priorities that the board is focused on right now. Next slide, Ryan. So to dig in a little bit more about the board, I know these will also be addressed in future remarks from the partnership, from the partnership coordinators. So I don't want to go too in depth on it here, but I'll just note that the board has 5 established committees, but the board also uses ad hoc working groups to get all of the work done that needs to be done. So they have a policy committee, which is composed of NFHP board members, and they primarily are handling things pertinent to the legislation or advocacy work on Capitol Hill, looking at questions related to the ACE Act or concerns related to reauthorization in 2025. The governance committee is also composed of all NFHP board members, and they handle the development of board policies and procedures, and they also interface with an attorney advisory group. And so that group is working on finalizing and presenting to the board for adoption a suite of policies in this year. The Science and Data Committee, which we have Gary Whalen on, who's one of the co-chairs, that's composed of NFHP board members as well as technical experts from many of our partner agencies and organizations. And that committee handles habitat assessments, the data management, and then Kate will talk a little bit later about the project tracking database. That also falls into Science and Data Committee realm. They also have a communications committee, which Ryan helps to staff. And that committee is made up of all NFHP board members as well. They handle the communication strategy, which was recently adopted earlier this year by the board. Things like branding and logo guidance, as well as communication initiatives. That's all handled under communications realm. And if you have any communications related questions, Ryan Roberts is your go-to person. And then the partnerships committee, I have it bolded here on the slide because the partnerships committee is the board committee, the only board committee right now where there are FHP coordinator members as well as NFHP board members. So this is a place where, as an FHP coordinator, you have the opportunity to engage and represent FHPs in these discussions. So the partnership committee serves kind of as a forum for preliminary board decisions and fact-finding and formulating recommendations for board actions. So you'll see a lot of times that bigger discussions that occur at the board level may get passed into the partnerships committee to kind of handle and continue to work on and work through and come up with a recommendation to bring back to the board for them to vote. So I kind of view it as a little bit of a liaison committee to relay information from the partnerships into the board and vice versa. I will note that the question has come up recently of whether FHP membership could also be considered on other board committees. So know that this is something in progress. As of right now, the only committee that's does have FHP membership is that partnerships committee, but I do think this is something that the board is willing to discuss, potentially adding FHP membership to these other committees. Gary, yeah, I see you have a hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention briefly that we do have FHP members on our Science and Data Committee. So there are a number, some are coordinators and some are Science and Data Committee members from FHPs that are a member. And I think there's 5 right now, if my memory is correct. So we are certainly open to have other FHP membership on the committee too.
Thanks, Gary, for that correction. Sorry for leaving that one off. So yeah, FHPs can engage in either of these committees. It's not a requirement, but it's an option. I'm going to hand it back over to Ryan to cover Beyond the Pond.
Thanks, Alex. And I will just quickly go through this because I know we want to give our FHP presenters as much time as possible. So in back around 2014, 2015 timeframe, the non-federal members of the National Fish Habitat Board voted to establish a nonprofit. that essentially would serve the fish habitat partnerships and be an organization established for NFHP to help partnerships, essentially raise their own funds and have the option to have uh, banking opportunities if they wanted to, essentially host outside funds outside of the NFHP funds that they would get from the Fish and Wildlife Service. Several of the FHPs, were not able to take in outside funds. We really only had one other fish habitat partnership, the Reservoir Fish Habitat Partnership, established as its own 501c3. So with that said, the nonprofit was incorporated, received its IRS approval in 2015, incorporated as the National Fish Habitat Fund, doing business as Beyond the Pond. Fish habitat partnerships are considered chapters of Beyond the Pond, and there were bylaws and original articles of incorporation developed. The board is a small board, and there's an overlap with the National Fish Habitat Board. The intent is to have 3 members overlap on both boards. There has been an online donation page established for Beyond the Pond, and any of the partnerships that would like to have their own online donation page, that's certainly available. We utilize Flipcause for the online donation page. Those donation pages that are directly linked to both the fishhabitat.org website and the website for the nonprofit, which is beyondthepondusa.com. The Beyond the Pond board, the chairman of the board is Kelly Hepler. He's a retired South Dakota Game Fish and Parks secretary. He was also the longtime chair of the National Fish Habitat Board. John Johnson serves as vice chair. He's a professor at the University of Arkansas Walton School of Business. Johnny Lecoq, he is the founder of Fish Pond Fly Fishing Company. He serves as the treasurer. He's also a National Fish Habitat Board member. Dick Luddington from Fay Ranches. Steve Moyer, who's now retired from Trout Unlimited, Vice President of Government Affairs. Christy Plummer, who is the Chief Conservation Officer at the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. She's also a National Fish Habitat Board member. And Doug Boyd, who serves several roles within the Coastal Conservation Association, the Gulf Council, and the Sport Fishing and Boating Partnership Council, which actually is being rechartered now. So he was also on the National Fish Habitat Board, serving as the representative from the Sport Fishing and Boating Partnership Council. That's a seat that is called out in the ACE Act. And we anticipate once that board is reestablished, they will seat a member on our board. I'll just cover a quick number of significant contributions to date. Bass Pro Shops has provided a couple of small grants to the partnership. Before in 2021, the National Fish Habitat Partnership benefited from a U.S. amateur bass fishing tournament, an 8-event tournament with a championship that Bass Pro held. A portion of registration fees were matched by both Toyota and Bass Pro Shops. We were awarded a check for $1.578 million. In the fall of 2021. That was turned into a grant program that funded 9 reservoir projects across the country. In addition to that, an initial grant that came into Beyond the Pond was a $250,000 grant for Mid-Atlantic black bass habitat through the Atlantic Coastal Fish Habitat Partnership, and that was made possible through the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council. A couple of marketing relationships that we've developed over the years. One is with Rep Your Water. They are a apparel and hat company based out of Colorado. They have some direct lines of hats that are related to fish and habitat in the driftless area, and also represent a lot of brook trout types of imagery in their hats, and coastal ones. Most of that hat line is through state hats. 3% of sales traditionally have gone to Beyond the Pond from sales of those products, as well as a larger pot of funds that go to a variety of conservation programs or partners that Rep Your Water works with through just some general lines of merchandise. And we're also working on a partnership being developed with Fish Pond to have some of our messaging and the work of the National Fish Habitat Partnership mentioned on some of their product hang tags. So that's kind of an in-process relationship. I will mention that Rep Your Water recently became a business partner of 1% for the Planet. They were able to bring us on as a conservation or environmental cause into 1% for the Planet. So we are now a 1% for the Planet recognized organization, and that was as of 2 weeks ago. So some of the Rep Your Water funding may change a bit, as their relationship with 1% changes, but they're certainly a big supporter of ours. This is just a shot of the receiving the check. This was in November at the conclusion of the National Bass Fishing Championships that was held at Table Rock Lake. So that's Johnny Morris in the red hat there with his hand on the check. He's the founder of Bass Pro Shops. And I think this is the end for me. And Alex, are you going to cover this one?
Yeah, actually, since Kate is still on, I'm going to let Kate jump in, but I know we've also had Sarah Strassman join since we started. Sarah, did you want to just unmute and do a quick intro and say your role in NFHP and where you're joining from?
Yeah, thanks so much, Alex. Sorry, everybody, I was a few minutes late. Glad to join everyone here. My name is Sarah Strassman. I'm the new Driftless Area Restoration Effort coordinator for NFHP. I work for Trout Unlimited as our kind of host organization. And I'm based in La Crosse, Wisconsin. So I'm covering the Driftless area from kind of the middle. And I started in July. So relatively new still, lots to learn. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, Kate, take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. Like I said in the beginning, one of my main roles as part of NFHP staff is managing the NFHP project tracking database. And this is a database that basically tracks information on all the NFHP funded and some NFHP supported projects since 2006. And in the past year, as many of you know, we've been in a big transition from our old data system to a brand new data system that we're now hosting on ArcGIS Online. And for many of you, for most of you this year, you were actively engaged in entering and updating information on your projects. And so we track information on basic information about each project, description as well as location, but also information such as financial contributions and metrics such as stream miles restored. And in the transition to the new data system, we are having folks enter projects into the database at the proposed project level so we can track it from the proposed status all the way through NFHP funded project status to completion. And this snapshot here is a picture of a dashboard that is summarizing information from the FY 2024 proposed projects. This dashboard is currently just internal to NFHP, but we will soon be creating something like this that is publicly available. And in terms of users of information from the database, obviously, a really important user is the NFHP board to be able to understand project status, the different types of projects we're tracking, the amount of funding we have, and basically our accomplishments. We also use the database for outreach purposes. So when we go to different events in different states, trying to identify the projects, the NFHP funded projects that have happened there, and also for reporting. So one of the big things that we will be doing annually is reporting to Department of Interior and Congress on the status of NFHP projects, and this database will really be the source of that information. So it's really important that we work with you to keep your project status updated. So this is all new and fresh, and lots of exciting opportunities to work with you all to update project information and continue to keep this database as up to date and accurate as possible. So thanks, everybody. I'll hand it back over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Kate. And we have to give Kate a huge round of applause for creating this awesome resource for us. It's going to really do a lot to help us organize and track information over the long term. And yeah, we really appreciate Kate pouring a lot of time into developing this and then training everybody on how to use it. So don't worry if you missed Kate's inaugural March trainings. I know there will be probably future opportunities to revisit how to use this and what has changed, but we really appreciate everything that you've done on this, Kate. It's awesome. Next slide, go ahead, Ryan. Just a quick note on this, and I want to have it handed over to Joe. Want to share that we have, for anybody involved in NFHP, and you'll definitely want to bookmark this on your resources. We have a annual calendar that lives on Canva that Ryan keeps updated. And so I just grabbed the snapshot of May just to showcase what's on here. But this is kind of a good one-stop shop to see what's going on in the month for things related to NFHP, at least at the national level. Go ahead on the next slide. We will send around the link for that in our follow-up email. And then I wanted to kind of try and summarize. I will say this is not an exhaustive thing, but these are the big key deadlines that I wanted to try to highlight in one place for FHP coordinators that are new. And I might have missed something, so I may open it up for folks if there's something here that or not here that should be here. So we have monthly calls with FHP coordinators, and so that's just an ongoing thing that you'll see on your calendar and as well on the NFHP calendar. Typically the fall to winter timeframe is when FHPs open up their RFP. I know this will get addressed a little bit later when the FHPs talk through this as well. And then they go through a collection period of proposals and review with steering committee. And that all leads into a March 31st deadline where FHPs submit their proposed project list to the board, as Kate mentioned, via this database. And then all of those top three yellow are all things that require action by FHPs. The other deadlines that are noted on the slide here are more board or Secretary of Interior or congressional reporting related, but I just wanted folks to have awareness of these kind of key deadlines and what their frequency is. So most of those other deadlines are all annual. The board submits their project list that they approve to the Secretary of Interior by July 1st, and the Secretary then has 90 days to return an approved list to the board. And then that waits for basically the federal budget process to occur, and then authorized projects and funded projects can be set up in agreements with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then every February, the board has to submit a report to Congress, or by February. And then I just noted the 5-year report here, since that timeline is quickly approaching 2025. There is a 5-year status and trends report on the status of this legislation that we will be submitting to Congress. I think that's kind of what I wanted to touch on. I know a lot of the partnership coordinators are going to address this stuff in much more detail, so I don't want to eat up more of their time. So I think I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Joe to talk about coordinating your FHP.
Thanks, Alex. And welcome again to the new coordinators. This is a lot of information that we're throwing at you at once. So if it feels like you're drinking from a fire hose, you are. And it's, you know, luckily they're recording it. And so hopefully you'll be able to kind of come back and process some of this. So again, I'm Joe Noner. I'm the coordinator for the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership. So that's one of the 20 fish habitat partnerships. And I'm happy to help, you know, talk through things you might be thinking about, questions you might have about your FHP as you move forward. So we, the FHP coordinators on this presentation, are going to try to touch on a few things, but really we're not going to be able to get to everything. And if we did, you'd be totally overwhelmed if you aren't already. So I'm just going to touch on a little bit regarding the how to coordinate your FHP and some of the things that that I think about when I coordinate my FHP. And so the first is kind of the structure of the FHP. And the 20 FHPs have a lot of different structures. And so there's no one right or wrong structure. I've provided an example for the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership structure here. And so we have a steering committee that oversees everything. And then we have 2 other subcommittees, the Science and Data and the Education and Outreach Committee. And for each of those committees, then we have chairs that are represented on the steering committee, and we have folks that have dual appointments on both the Science and Data and the Education Outreach team. And our hope is that that allows them to help coordinate a little bit better, excuse me. And you'll see that I sit in this little triangle right in the middle, where, you know, my job is to try to keep all of these folks pointed in the right direction, coordinated, on time, making deadlines, and remembering, frankly, what they did at the last meeting so we can keep moving forward at the next meeting. But there are a lot of different operational structures that FHPs might take. And so, you know, I encourage you to talk with the folks that may be on your steering committees or involved with your partnership, and ask them whether the structures that you have, you know, work for you now, whether there's reason to reconsider those structures. When I came on, there wasn't an education and outreach team on our partnership, and we created that. So, you know, there's an opportunity with the new coordinator to revisit your structure as well. And I think there was a question about steering committees in general. So our steering committee on the MGLP directs my work, and it's my job to support that committee. But you know, I think it's fair to say that our committee members aren't thinking about the MGLP in their day-to-day as often, and so it's my job to, you know, be the kind of almost executive director as much as coordinator. And I think that probably a lot of FHPs would say the same thing, trying to really lead from below as well. Next slide, please. And so I want to just touch on a few different major activity areas that some of the FHPs work on. The first is conservation projects. And this is one of the main functions and common denominators for all of the FHPs. And you heard a lot of talk about this earlier in the project database and the funding. Funding mechanisms vary for how the FHPs accomplish projects. So some FHPs, including the MGLP, really only use U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service funds to accomplish projects. These are the funds that are allocated through NFHP. Others have relationships with their partners. Maybe it's states, maybe it's private donors. And so they're able to access other funds and distribute those as part of their either their request for proposals for their grants or through other mechanisms. So it really depends, and I think it's something that is worth looking into, the process for your partnership and how you've done it historically. In terms of how partnerships decide which grants to fund, which conservation projects to fund, as Alex alluded, typically we'll do requests for proposals in the fall, and then we'll have either a subcommittee that's appointed by a steering committee members themselves, or in some cases, coordinators are making executive decisions when they don't have a functional steering committee. So there are a number of different mechanisms and ways that folks decide on a ranked list of projects that they submit to the NFHP board for consideration. And there's no real wrong or right way. It's just what fits best for your partnership. Next slide, please. And the next thing that the MGLP at least does a lot of is outreach and education. Many of the habitat problems that we face in the MGLP are so again on our inland lakes in the upper Midwest are the result of humans, and so we're trying to get at that source, that cause. But the investment in outreach really varies based on which partnership you're talking about. And a lot of the implementation for outreach, in my experience, falls on the coordinator. So this is something you scale up at your own risk and based on your calendar. Some FHPs do have outreach committees like the MGLP that help provide advice, or in some cases help to execute their outreach. And so, yeah, Ryan, if you want to just click through these. Some examples for the MGLP, we've got webinars that we operate. We do a quarterly newsletter that announces our grant, but also activities that we're up to. And then we maintain a pretty serious presence on Twitter. And so those are some of the outreach activities that we have. Other FHPs are more grassroots, and they, for example, Fishers and Farmers has a series of meetings that they have with their producers. So there's a bunch of different ways that folks interact and do outreach. Next slide, please. And then finally, science. So this varies by the Fish Habitat Partnership and often occurs through science committees that complete the work or use grant funding to complete work. One thing is that usually science is framed as assessments, conservation planning, or monitoring and evaluation. We're typically not conducting basic science with the NFHP funds. And I put a couple examples here below of kind of conservation planning work and assessments of nutrient sources in the lake and in the MGLP. Next slide. And then I think finally for me, just strategic planning. You're going to need to have a strategic plan when the FHP applies to the board and ultimately to Congress to be approved in the near future here. Those plans can include priority species and priority areas. They're not required, but they are helpful. And I just added some questions here that I think are really worth thinking about in terms of trying to figure out what your niche is. And so I think it's really valuable as a new coordinator to talk with your partners and really try to figure out where your partnership is providing value added and where it might be redundant, and try to stress those areas where you're providing value added. And a scan of the other fish habitat partnerships might be able to help provide some examples there. I think that's my last slide, but go to the next one. Oh yeah, just briefly, you've got to fund your operations for your partnership, and I think we'll touch on this a little bit later, but you can access up to $85,000 through a grant that's applied through the NFHP process for operations. And so that pays for things like your salary, printing, et cetera. And it is important that you have a one-to-one match for that, as well as all of your other grants. And that's a big challenge for a lot of us partnerships. And we're happy to talk with you more about how you can get there when we cross that bridge. All right. I think that's it for me.
Okay, you want me to just pick it up from here, Alex? I do have a hard stop at 3:15, so I'm just gonna get right into it because I did want to give time. So is there a delay on my video? It looks like there's a problem on my end.
I think
Looks
you're all
good to
good.
me.
It's sounding good on my end, Lori.
Okay,
Sounds good here too,
Sounds and
Lori.
looks good
Okay.
here.
Thank you. I did just want to give 30 seconds to let folks just stand up and stretch your legs, or I actually want to encourage you to, if you're not already writing down notes, write a question that is generated by the past couple of presentations that you might want to have addressed in a follow-up one of these sessions. So I'm just going to give you like 10 seconds to stand up and stretch, get the blood pumping. Okay, so next slide, Ryan, please. So you're the central point of contact for your FHP, and it's an organization that likely has a very wide reach and many partners, and there are a few of those partners that are arguably really central to your work, and those two that we are talking about today are really the NFHP board and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I think we could talk more about the service later in another call, and I think Debbie's going to touch on it as well. But I did want to make a strong suggestion that as you begin in your first weeks to months, that you do make a direct effort to reach out to your Fish and Wildlife Conservation Office representatives, because they are really going to be central to your work, and have a meeting with them, get to know them, and establish a great relationship. So you are likely to be the only liaison between your FHP and the National Fish Habitat Board. So it's a good idea to periodically give your steering committee a high-level overview of what's happening with NFHP. These folks are, have full-time day jobs, so it's really great if you're not already articulate at giving high-level overviews and managing up. It's really great to practice that. And likewise, it's also really great when you're corresponding with the NFHP board to deliver the most salient points about your FHP. All the FHPs are very different and diverse, but there are places where we overlap. And usually when we get together as like with the partnerships committee or with other NFHP groups, we try to figure out those places of convergence when we've got points that we want to convey to the NFHP board. So we're being as direct as possible. It's best to you want to, can you advance the slide? I think I might have had a different version of, there we go, okay. Okay, so can you go to the next slide, please? Now I'm caught up, okay. So when you're communicating with the board, it's best to interact directly with the staff first. So go to the staff level, Alex, Ryan, especially if you have questions about deadlines and things like that, make sure that their email addresses, which Alex is going to share all the staff email addresses, I think, following this webinar. Make sure that they're favorited so that you make sure you get all of their emails, because a lot of those deadlines that we threw at you before in this presentation, that they do a great job of reminding you of those. So so make sure that you do check your emails for those communications. Most board meetings are virtual or hybrid, and Alex will send out the calendar links for those. We are occasionally, as a joint FHP or individual FHPs, are occasionally given a chance at board meetings to present a short in a short time slot. And occasionally the board will ask direct questions of FHPs at those board meetings. So you will have time to address questions and interact with the board. We do occasionally have in-person board meetings, and you are encouraged to attend those in person, but it's not required. But committees are really a great place to interact with board members, and a great place to begin. I know Alex went over a bunch of those committees before. There is FHP involvement in 2 committees. So next slide, please. And that's the partnerships committee, which Alex mentioned, is really that liaison group. And the science and data committee, like Gary said, does have FHP representation on it. And these are both great places to not only provide your own expertise and your own input to assist with all of the operations of the board and all the various activities, including things like the national assessment and national conservation priorities. But it's also a way for you to maintain that connection and learn more about the ongoings of NFHP. It's really a good way of getting in there and seeing firsthand how things work and making more connections. Next slide, please. So deadlines. So, and somebody just asked about deadlines in the comments there. Many of these deadlines that we have are based on legislation and are fixed. So it's just good to keep in mind that we are working within the constraints of legislation. Next slide, please. This is a little road diagram. It's one of many ways that we can represent the annual cycle for FHPs. And Alex went over it a little bit. Debbie's going to go over it. Maybe repetition's not a bad thing. Essentially, your RFP is likely to open in the fall. If you start in the bottom left-hand corner here, in January to March is when FHP's committees are working on reviewing applications. And then in March is when we are required to submit these applications as a whole suite of packages plus our operations funding to the NFHP board. And that's what that red exclamation point is, because that's a very important and hard deadline. So please make sure that you budget out your month of March so that you can give a lot of attention to NFHP in March. And then in July, the NFHP board forwards their recommendations to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And in the fall, at the same time that you might be generating your next year's RFP, that's when the service makes its determination, its approval. And that approval can take months to make its way back to you because it's dependent on the congressional appropriations cycle. So there's a waiting game until the spring. Meanwhile, while you're waiting for that prior year's authorization for your projects, you're now in your next cycle working on projects and getting information and recruiting applicants. And so then it starts all over again, in winter, spring, reviewing applications and submitting an application in March. And then the following summer, usually around this time of year is when you would expect to start working with your partners to help connect them to the Fish and Wildlife Service so that they can execute their agreements. And also you'll be working to execute your own agreement for funding with the service for your operations. Next slide, please. So the service agreements and deadlines, there's a lot more that we could go into about that, but just make sure, like I mentioned before, that they're going to be your best friends. So just make sure you have those contacts and you stay on top of those deadlines to make sure that everything gets funded in time. There's additional deadlines that I think others are going to go over. So there's the congressional nomination process and communications, and Ryan shared before communications calendar. And I think that brings me to the end of my presentation. So I will turn it over to Debbie.
Mhm. Great. Thanks, Lori. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Alex and Ryan, for all of your great information that you guys have shared. And I just want to take a second and welcome all of our new coordinators to the call. Really appreciate your guys' attendance today, and a huge thanks to the staff for pulling this together. I think it'll be not only a really helpful archive video recording for new folks, but also for existing coordinators. I continue to learn things from this call today. And I know, I think as Heidi mentioned, this is going to be a resource for our steering committees. One of the things I wanted to mention is in putting this together, we recognize we only have an hour and a half, and this is a tremendous amount of information to be trying to share. And also knowing that you trying to take it in is difficult. So one thing I want to mention before I jump into what I want to talk about regarding funding is mention that we do plan to have additional calls. And so, as Lori mentioned when she introduced herself, if you guys can take a second to write down a couple of burning questions that either these presentations have sparked, or and this is for existing coordinators too. If there's something that you feel we could follow up on, that would be super helpful. And you can use the chat here, or maybe through a follow-up email to Alex, in response to the invite to this meeting. That would be super helpful for us. I'm going to talk a little bit about funding, and I know that funding has come up in a number of the different presentations ahead, but I just wanted to, and Ryan, you could go ahead and go on to the next summary slide. I didn't provide a lot of detailed slides, thank you, just because knowing we didn't have a lot of time, and I wanted to just hit the real high level, and knowing that funding is something that all of us as coordinators, it's a huge part of our role as a coordinator, and we continue to have some questions in how things are rolling out, and especially understanding deadlines. And I want to thank you, Lori. Your schematic is excellent, and I think maybe we'll continue to use that to help folks identify important deadlines. But I just want to hit on some real high level things for new coordinators, and potentially identify some areas where we could have follow-up conversation. So first off is, as folks kind of heard through the introductory comments, really the beginning funding for this program, and again, the continued funding for it, has come through the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that was again codified under the ACE Act. And I just want to take this opportunity to really thank the service for their long-term commitment to the NFHP program, and the tremendous amount of work that's happened in the past and continues to happen today in terms of administrating that funding, both for the coordination of FHPs and the work that we're doing, as well as the on-the-ground projects. I think this is an area that continues to somewhat be of sort of some misunderstanding in what FHPs do. I think even from the board, I think there's this misunderstanding that FHPs are out there doing all of this on the grounds work, when actually it's really our partners that are doing the on the grounds work, but it is coordinated and facilitated through FHPs, and very importantly, through this relationship that we have with the Fish and Wildlife Service to administer, and move that funding once it's allocated through congressional budgets down into the board process, and submitted it out to FHPs and the funded projects that come from our suggested lists. All of that is really tied up into the work that we're doing to coordinate this process. And as Joe mentioned, that process of determining what the FHP designated list of partner projects are, it's not a one size fits all. Not everyone is doing it quite the same way. Although I would say the majority of us do use a request for proposal process. And something that's really important to understand about that RFP process is that hard deadline that Lori did a good job of exclamating on her schematic. March 31st is the deadline that's called out in the ACE Act, when each FHP needs to submit to the NFHP board our suggested on the ground projects, as well as our coordination request. And some, and those are optional too. Some, I believe there's maybe one FHP that isn't requesting coordination funding. So that's, again, we're all kind of doing things a little bit differently. Things that aren't tied in stone, how you're operating, but those coordination funds are an option. And hopefully it is an option that your FHP is considering. And that happens through a cooperative agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And something I think as would be helpful for a future call is the Fish and Wildlife Service. They put out a directed announcement each year for those funds. And it's really important, as the program has changed under the ACE Act, some new ways of all that, how that's being administered has somewhat changed. And so I know that our partnership is looking at updating our RFP process with some of this new knowledge as a result of kind of how the program has changed under the ACE Act. And so that directed announcement is, I think, a really important resource. And Alex and Ryan, maybe we can help make that available to folks. So the FY23 a directed announcement is out now, and hopefully all of the coordinators are using that in helping their partner projects, develop their cooperative agreements with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So something that I want to kind of mention just quickly and high levelly, I know we don't have a lot of time here, is that is a role that as a coordinator, it's something that I help. So when we put our list of potential funded projects forth to the board, and once those projects are approved for funding, I'm helping to work with the service and the project leads in getting those cooperative agreements moved forward. And having that directed guidance announcement is really helpful for that. The timeline of that I want to mention is it's a bit out of our control, and it has to do with the way congressional budgets are funded and when those budgets are understood. So one more thing I want to maybe mention real quickly is the timeline. So we know that the March 31st deadline is important for submitting our projects to the NFHP board, but the timeline of that is, for a future fiscal year. So at the same time that that's happening, the previous year is actually becoming implemented. So the Fish and Wildlife Service budgets are known. The NFHP board goes through their process of reaffirming the funding that goes to FHPs and which projects are going to receive funding, and then those projects go through the process of having the cooperative agreements executed. And so there is a timeline delay there. And I think this is an area it is kind of complicated, so I don't think we have time to really dive into it now, but this is an area where I think it would be super helpful that we have future calls and perhaps, explore some different ways that different FHPs are dealing with that. We have language in our RFP that really tries to spell that out and some of the uncertainty that comes with that, so that our project proposers are aware of that and are developing their project proposals accordingly. So I think that's an area that we could help, especially if other FHPs are looking at revamping any of their RFP processes. So I'm just going to pause on that. I want to give Alex and Ryan the end of their time to hit the other couple topics that we wanted to talk about. I'll just mention real quickly, there are these other NFHP related funding opportunities that folks are able to take advantage of. If you're a coastal FHP, NOAA has an amazing recreational fisheries engagement funding program, and Alex has done an excellent job of administering that. It's good to look for that in the fall. I believe the last one came out in October. The multi-state grant funding opportunity, I'm sure you saw the recent note from Ryan, that's in process now. And as Joe mentioned, there's a whole host of other funding opportunities that FHPs are taking advantage of. And I'm hoping in future calls we can dive into that. Okay, I'm going to jump off, Ryan, and turn it over to you, and apologize for things having to go so quickly. I think you're muted there, Ryan.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Debbie, and thanks to the other coordinators for for taking sections of this presentation. Much appreciated. So I'll touch a little bit on communications nationally, and we may shift to looking at the website a little bit. We may not have time for that, but certainly we'll take that as a send home resource for you all. So just looking at the fishhabitat.org website, we do have a nice photo of an on the ground project at the beginning. Typically, the way that this website is structured is there's kind of an initial landing page, and it does rotate. So we'll put a lot of our big things that we do, including like waters to watch up there, and rotate those through. There are some tabs at the top about, gives a lot of the history of NFHP, and I won't go into the web page just because we just don't have a lot of time. There's also the partnerships are all listed. There's also coordinator bios. So I'll just flag this, and typically I've reach out to new coordinators. Given we've had some changes, I may not have reached out to everyone yet, but if you want to just familiarize yourself with where the coordinator bios are, and just make sure I have your name right and spelling right for listing as a contact under your FHP, under the partnerships page, just please let me know, or reach out if you have any questions. Waters to watch, that gives kind of it covers all of the waters to watch projects that are done in that annual year, displays them by a map. There's also historical waters to watch projects as pinpoints on maps, and projects descriptions as well. We have a science and resources tab. You can find a lot of the assessment work, and sort of where the assessment data mapper lies with USGS on that. And we put all of our news stories up on our news pages. So we're typically, trying to update that every week to 2 weeks with new info. And of course, any of the contact info for any of the staff are there. And then there's also the opportunity to provide donations through Beyond the Pond. That link is just on our homepage, though. I will say that we also have a newsletter that goes out monthly. We do have calendar reminders in the Canva calendar. I also try to send emails out to staff, to FHP coordinators. If you have info or news that you'd like to share, our newsletter list goes out to about 1,700 individuals, and they're people that come through and sign up for the newsletter right off of our homepage, and that sign up is at the bottom. So this is really just the waters to watch, just a look at that. I was kind of going across the tabs on that first page. So a couple of communications products I'll just discuss here real briefly. We do have an NFHP annual report. We do have all the entries in from all 20 FHPs for the 2022 annual report. We'll be putting that together for staff to look at, and then we will share that out before we go to design and layout of that with the FHP coordinators. We also develop some fact sheets. They're on our news page, and we also will develop infographics related to the annual projects that are announced for this year. So one on the FY23 projects will be coming out shortly. We also have news and press releases that go out, whether that's related to like the Bass Pro funding and some things like that, and all those can be found on the news page on our website. And we also make an effort every year to have a booth at the American Fisheries Society meeting. And we'll typically look for help or any volunteers from FHPs that want to help staff the table or put any of your FHP information out at the booth. That's one thing that, we always strive to get to every year, to have a marketing booth at. And I'll kick it over to Alex to wrap this up.
Thanks, Ryan. Just go ahead to the next one. I'll keep this really brief. I know I alluded to this process earlier, but just to kind of revisit and spend a quick minute just reviewing what this is for folks. So as part of the ACE Act, one of the provisions outlines that all of the fish habitat partnerships, in order to continue receiving that fish and wildlife serving funding that folks covered earlier, you have to be formally designated by Congress. And so that has to happen within 5 years of the ACE Act being signed into law in 2020. So we are working with primarily our partnerships committee of the board has been handling sort of taking a look at what is the best way to sort of go about tackling this process in order to meet this deadline. So I outlined I kind of pulled the high level bulleted version of the initial requirements that are outlined in the ACE Act there on the slide. Like I mentioned, the board partnerships committee has been developing a form that will be sort of the driver of how this process will go, where FHPs apply to the board. The board will sort of serve as an interim review before they choose to nominate everybody to Congress. So we're likely to start seeing that process begin to pick up here later this year. So I just wanted to flag that as something that's probably going to be like kind of a hot item that you start hearing about. And it's very likely that we'll be dedicating one of our monthly FHP calls coming up just to this topic, just to get kind of everybody up to speed, because this is not just new for new coordinators, this is new for everybody. So this is a new requirement, a new process that we're going to be undertaking. And I will mention that this process has been informed by a lot of our policy folks and policy committee, given that they are savvy with communicating on the Hill. They are helping to kind of inform how we best develop this process so that it can be successful. So go ahead to the last slide, Ryan. I know we went over a lot of information really quickly with you all, but we really hope that this provided a good, at least getting your feet wet, getting you thinking, and really appreciate all of the FHP coordinators who joined, who helped provide comments on the agenda, who helped speak today and share information. You guys really helped make this happen. This was a huge team effort, so we really appreciate your time, and welcome aboard to all the new folks. We didn't want to overwhelm you all with all of that extra information and materials before coming into this meeting. So we will be following up with the recording and presentation that we gave today, as well as additional important info that you should save in your NFHP folder or bookmark on your browsers so that you can easily access it later. And I see that we had a quick question in the chat about when Waters to Watch are nominated. So this timing has shifted year to year recently, just given that we've had our hands full implementing the ACE Act. So I actually think, Ryan, is this going to be on the communications committee plate to determine when this next campaign for Waters to Watch is going to go around?
Yes, it will be. We actually have a call a little bit later this month with the board members that are on the communications committee. So it'll be this fall.
Okay.
We don't have a date quite yet, but it'll be in the fall.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah, for that question. Are there any other questions? I want to open it up and allow for folks to have any questions addressed today that they may have had, but I appreciate Lori's idea of gathering those questions for a future follow-up call. So anybody want to chime in with a question before we sign off?
It's Simon here. I guess I did have one very quick question, although it's pretty specific to my partnership. So there was recently like a newly formed sort of East Coast SAD collaborative that, I joined as a member. And I was just wondering sort of what level of sort of coordination or cooperation in terms of sharing information with them, or potentially, if there's any sort of overlap there that does that go against anything by NFHP standards, you know, in terms of sort of collaborating with projects or, you know, announcements, any kind of just sharing information?
My initial impression is I would say go for it. I don't think there's any issues there. I don't know if any other coordinators that are on want to speak to maybe something similar you might have in your own regions, or if there's other kind of local groups that you team up with. All right, I think Simon, it's fair game.
All right. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure before I sort of, you know, build a rapport, because they're very newly formed, right? So they're kind of trying to get a steering committee together, and obviously SAV is an important habitat as well. And I figured they kind of cover the same areas as, you know, the Atlantic Coastal Fish Habitat Partnership. So in terms of just general activities along the East Coast, I figured there'd be a lot of overlap there. So just kind of wanted to start building some kind of collaboration with them.
Yeah, it sounds like a great opportunity. All right, I know we went a little bit over time, so appreciate.
You
Alex,
muted
we
yourself,
lost you.
Alex.
Oh, whoops.